What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
If you had told me back when we still shared a bathroom and a curling iron that my sister would end up being the one person who could hollow out my life with the speed of a storm ripping shingles from a roof, I would have laughed and said she didn't even return lip gloss without acting like I should pay a rental fee. Yet here I am, telling you how one late autumn weekend in a tidy Midwestern house with a wreath that said, "Bless this home," turned into the day I stopped being anyone's daughter and became a rumor with a pulse, because apparently in our town a lie with enough hairspray holds better than the truth ever does. I grew up in a family that worshipped two things with equal devotion: Sunday morning appearances and what other people might be saying at the grocery store, and my older sister Lana fit that altar like a stained glass saint. The kind who smiles without moving her mouth while somehow collecting committee posts, homecoming tiaras, and casseroles as if life were a raffle and she had purchased all the winning tickets, while I moved through junior and senior year like a person with a flashlight inside her chest, trying to keep it steady, doing well in classes, keeping a small circle of friends, and nursing the quiet belief that if I just kept my head down long enough I would graduate and nobody's opinion would matter except mine. The lie started in the breathless space after a football game, in those hallways that smell like floor polish and popcorn oil, when a sophomore I barely knew asked me in a voice pitched to be overheard if I still had the party vitamins. And I made a joke that fell like a cup of marbles, because sarcasm has never been my sport, and by Monday the rumor had bounced from the locker room to church pews that creak at the worst moments, and what could have been swatted down with one adult conversation became, under Lana's expert hands, a full-color brochure on my supposed lifestyle, which, for the record, included reheated noodles, library books, and a stubborn belief that kissing did not require a committee. I did not know she had converted whispers into something that looked like evidence until the principal called me in and slid a printout across his desk, a screenshot of a text thread that featured my name and a string of messages about picking up later. Except the timestamp was wrong, the slang wasn't mine, and the contact photo was an old picture from a phone I had lost in a parking lot 2 summers earlier, which is when the flashlight in my chest sputtered, not because I was afraid of suspension, but because the number at the top of the thread belonged to Lana's ex-boyfriend, a charmer who once told me I had bookstore energy, like it was an insult, and whose idea of flirting was borrowing your charger and never returning it. At home that night, I expected questions, maybe even the kind where parents ask you to sit at the table and drink tea you did not request, yet the living room had the chilly order of a staged home. And my mother's hands were folded in her lap like a sealed envelope while my father paced as if counting steps could shake truth loose, and Lana, sweet, helpful, backlit by the lamp, said she loved me but could not cover for me anymore. Which would have been funny if my throat were not already closing, because I had never asked her to cover anything, not once, and when I said that, she made the kind of face a person makes when the souffle collapses and blames humidity. It went fast after that, faster than the first snow when the roads haven't been salted, my father saying it would be healthier for me to find my own path elsewhere, my mother looking everywhere but at my face, and Lana standing very still like a ballerina in a music box, which is the pose she always takes when she wants to look noble without doing anything at all, and I remember the sensation of my life tipping like wet laundry in a basket, heavy and sliding. When I went to my room to pack, the kind of suitcase you throw together when you cannot think and yet somehow remember to fold socks, because order feels like the only lifeline left. Here is where I admit that the flashlight inside me did not completely die, because when a person has been raised on polite betrayals and ornamental grace, she learns to wrap her backbone in silk and still keep it straight. So before I zipped the suitcase, I opened my laptop and found the folder I had been ignoring for months, the one with Lana's name and a tidy collection of screenshots I had taken when I borrowed her tablet to upload photos and stumbled across a private chat where she bragged to her friend about flipping metabolism boosters to the freshman dance team and skimming cash from the booster club's silent auction by adjusting totals, since nobody checks the math if the cookies are cute, and although my stomach dropped through the floor, I closed the tablet that day because I wanted to believe that goodness, if left alone, would grow like a houseplant toward the light. That night, with the suitcase open and the air tasting like old pennies, I stopped believing in houseplants and set up a delayed email from a throwaway account, attaching those screenshots along with the Booster Club's Venmo records that Lana had helpfully saved in a notes app titled Taxes, and I addressed it to the principal, the school board treasurer, the dance coach who still sent me holiday cards, and the local paper's tips inbox, then scheduled it for midnight so nobody would think I had pressed send in anger, which felt less like revenge and more like placing a mirror in a hallway that had been dark for too long and finally turning on the light. When I came back downstairs with my one suitcase and my winter coat folded over my arm because I suddenly could not ask anyone for a hanger, my mother was standing by the door as if she had been stationed there by a tour guide, and my father held the knob like a man posed for a brochure on decisive parenting, and Lana looked me up and down with the kind of pity you wear like a corsage, and my mother said in a voice so quiet it went through me rather than into my ears that I was not her daughter anymore, and the porch light cut a bright circle on the concrete like a stage where you are not allowed to speak. I stepped into the circle, and the door eased shut behind me with a softness that felt crueler than a slam, and while the lock turned, my phone vibrated with a flood of messages from people who had not texted me in months, each one a variation on the new story that had just been born about me, and I stood there in the chilly air with my suitcase handle sweating in my palm and listened to the house breathe like a sleeping animal, counting in my head to keep from crying, one slow number after another, until the porch light clicked off and I was alone with the crickets and a midnight email already on its way to people who would finally have to decide what to do with the truth. The first night in the city did not feel like triumph so much as a slow bleed of noise and fear, because even though I had pressed send on the truth in a way that could not be unpressed and watched the little progress bar crawl toward midnight as if crawling toward oxygen, I still ended up on a friend's sofa with a sweatshirt for a pillow, keeping my shoes by my ribs like a strange kind of armor, listening to the radiator cough and the upstairs neighbor practice trumpet at the exact hour when people with normal lives collapse, and while I lay there I made a quiet pact with myself that if this was exile then I would learn its language, because exile with purpose is just training under a darker sky. Morning found me with the sort of courage that smells like cheap coffee and possibility, and I took the bus to a walk-in diner where the manager looked me over the way a farrier looks at a horse, assessing the hooves before deciding if it could carry anything worth the feed, and I said I could handle the register, the breakfast rush, the regular who always wants extra napkins, and the credit card machine that likes to die when the line is longest. And by noon I had a name tag and a locker and a fresh burn on my wrist from a tray I lifted too fast, a small bright reminder that even tiny mistakes leave a mark, but they also heal if you keep moving your hand. Money trickled, not poured, so I picked up shifts like seashells, not glamorous but solid, each one contributing to a pile that would pay for a community college class, and then another. A little procession of credits marching toward a degree that announced I understood what trauma looks like when it is dressed in politeness, and how to help people carry it without letting it settle into their bones like cold. And in the evenings I would lace my sneakers and walk the long rectangle of my new neighborhood, past the pharmacy with the flickering sign and the thrift store window that always displayed one sequined dress and one broken blender, as if to say we see your dreams and your mess, and we'll price them both with a sticker gun. I stopped checking hometown group chats because a person cannot heal inside a room lined with mirrors angled to show only your worst angles, yet I kept a private calendar of aftershocks, small confirmations that the midnight email had not vanished into the same oblivion where apologies go to die. The Booster Club announced a surprise audit with language so polite it squeaked. The dance coach sent me a message that simply said thank you with a period like a full stop after a long sentence, and the local paper ran a very careful piece about record-keeping irregularities that named nobody but left plenty of space for readers to fill in blanks with the precision of people who practice gossip the way some people play the piano. On my days off I met with a campus counselor who wore bracelets that chimed like distant bells when she gestured, and we talked about the kind of loyalty that asks you to disappear so the family photograph looks tidy. about how love without curiosity is just management, and about the way anger can either keep you warm like a hand warmer or burn your fingers if you keep gripping it as if it were the only thing you owned. And while I did not become a saint in those sessions, I practiced building sentences that did not shrink me and choosing jokes that kept me human, the kind of humor that says I see the ridiculous shape of this pain and will not let it call itself destiny. Because I am not made entirely of virtue, I also built a small workshop of practical mischief, focused not on damage but on narrative control, and one afternoon, after a class on digital footprints where a professor with the posture of a fencer explained how a person's name can be a battlefield, I bought the domain of my full name for the price of a pair of discount sneakers, then spent a long evening writing a clear, unadorned timeline that laid out dates, screenshots, and the wonderful dullness of official records, including the carrier confirmation that my old number was reported stolen the summer those phantom texts appeared, and the letter from the principal acknowledging that the messages used to implode my reputation had metadata more suspicious than a coupon that never expires, and when the page was done I tucked it behind a clean landing screen that looked like a modest resume. Because truth is most effective when it arrives wearing sensible shoes. The site by itself would have been a whisper in a rainstorm, so I did one more thing that made me laugh in a way that sounded a little too sharp to be pretty, which was to mail a single postcard to the church secretary back home. A woman who runs the prayer chain with the efficiency of an air traffic controller and the diplomacy of a referee, and the card contained nothing incendiary, just a tidy URL and a note that said, "I appreciate accurate prayers," which meant by the end of the week the link had traveled along the grapevine in a series of emails loaded with phrases like "thought you should see" and "hope this clarifies," and although I will never know exactly whose eyes widened at which paragraph, I do know that my mother's best friend sent a brief, almost tender message that read, "I had no idea and I am sorry," which felt like finding a small light left on in a long hallway. With rent still predatory and my ambition larger than my paycheck, I moved from the sofa to a room the size of a decent closet, learned to cook actual food instead of melting cheese on anything that held still, and let myself fall for Ethan, who had the patient hands of a person who fixes things for a living and the kind of face that looks even better when he listens, which he did often, not to interrogate but to keep me from piling rocks on my chest, and when I told him about Lana, he did not offer a sermon, only said that some people sell out their own blood for the applause of strangers and call the echo a blessing, and that I should build a life so sturdy that, even if they knock again, the only thing that falls is their illusion of power. By spring I had a job at a nonprofit that felt like a place where the air itself kept promises, and my name, once a cautionary tale in a town shaped like a whisper, now sat quietly on a page that told the story straight for anyone willing to read past the first rumor. I was learning to be content without needing an audience, which is perhaps why the universe decided it was the perfect moment to send one. Because on a Wednesday evening after a meeting about grant language and a bus ride that smelled like wet umbrellas, my phone chimed with a request from an account I knew better than my own handwriting, Lana's profile photo cropped so close you could count the mascara clumps. And the message said she hoped I would come home for our mother's birthday since family should heal while everyone is still around to witness it, a line so neat and sharp it felt like a blade slid under the skin. And while I stared at it, Ethan asked if I wanted tea or something stronger, and I said both. Because the part of me that wanted peace tugged at my sleeve, while the part of me that remembered the porch light going dark unhooked the chain on my patience. I did not answer her, not yet, because silence can be a statement and also a fuse, and I had one more small, exquisitely targeted act to deliver before I let her into any room that contained my pulse, so I opened my laptop, pulled up the evidence that had slept untouched since winter, and began stitching it into a packet labeled with a name that would make her spine go ice cold when she saw it, the dance team parent liaison who never forgives arithmetic sins. Then hovered over send long enough to feel the weight of my own breath and press the key, while Lana's message sat unread and a second bubble began to form on the screen as if the next sentence she typed might finally tell me what she wanted: absolution, attention, or a stage. Only I let it grow without opening it, because a person who once locked me out of my own life could wait one more night to learn that doors can swing the other way. The packet I stitched together for the dance team parent liaison moved like a quiet storm front that nobody saw until the barometer crashed. Because 2 days after I pressed send, a message appeared in my inbox with the kind of punctuation you only see when someone is forcing calm through clenched teeth, thanking me for my thorough timeline, requesting the original files for record-keeping, and noting that the Booster Club would convene a special meeting to address accounting discrepancies. Spanning the last 2 seasons, which was the sort of sentence that looks polite until you imagine it read aloud by a woman who keeps color-coded binders and can identify a missing receipt the way a birder spots a finch through fog. And while I did not dance around my kitchen, I did let the kettle whistle a little longer than necessary because the sound felt like an exhale I had been holding since the night the porch light went dark. News in a small town travels the way oil creeps across water, slow and total, and within a week the local paper, which has never met a euphemism it didn't adopt like a stray cat, ran a careful piece about irregularities in fundraising reports at the high school, the kind of article that names no one but points with its whole body, while the church bulletin, which pretends to be about potlucks and hymn numbers, included a paragraph on integrity and stewardship that had Lana's perfume all over it, because when she feels heat she performs holiness as if virtue were a pageant with sashes, and I almost admired the commitment to choreography even as I watched the audience begin to check their programs and realize the casting had changed. My parents did not call, which I expected, but they called Ethan, which I did not, and he told me with a face that was both gentle and resolute that my father wanted assurances I was moving on without bitterness, a phrase that lands like a velvet brick, because the people who refuse to bandage the wound always seem to police how you carry the scar, and Ethan, who has a gift for compassion that does not conscript his spine, said he told my father that I was building a life that left very little room for bitterness, though it left exactly the right amount of room for truth, and that any future conversation would require a starting point other than the wall they built and hung my photo on like a caution sign. Because narrative is a field I plow now, not a wind that carries me away, I did something small and strategically bright, which was to pitch the city paper on a profile of our nonprofit's court advocacy program for women who are dragged through hearings where their voices are treated like background noise. And when the reporter came by with a notebook and a camera lens that could have photographed the moon, I gave her the story straight. No violins, just calendars and signatures and plain language about how people survive the sort of bureaucratic cold that makes your teeth ache, and somewhere in the middle of the piece I mentioned, with the casual precision of a person who carries receipts, that I understood reputational harm because my own name had been bent into a shape that did not fit my face, and I watched her pen pause as she asked for the spelling of my full name and the URL of the site where I had laid the evidence gently down, which meant that by Friday there was a respectful article with my photograph in a doorway that looked like a possibility rather than a verdict, and a hyperlink that said, in the clean font of a newspaper, that names deserve context, not rumors. Lana did not text about the article, because acknowledging my life requires lifting the heavy end of the furniture, yet she posted a photo of herself holding a devotional book at a coffee shop, captioned about forgiveness, with so many hashtags the thing looked like a net, and then, because the universe enjoys timing, the dance liaison sent a second email asking whether I could clarify a set of Venmo screenshots that showed rounding adjustments after an auction, and the screenshots, which I had saved months earlier because my survival instincts now wear glasses and carry a stapler, matched Lana's notes down to the last tidy emoji, which felt less like a victory and more like finding the correct Allen wrench at the bottom of the flat pack box, useful, inevitable, and a little sad. My mother finally reached out with a letter that smelled faintly of the cedar drawer where she keeps wedding programs and sympathy cards, in which she wrote in her careful church handwriting that she could not reconcile the girl she raised with the behavior described by so many, a sentence that would have gutted me 2 years ago but now only made me tired, because the way she framed it excused the lazy math of consensus. And I wrote back a single sheet enclosed in a bright green envelope so she would not lose it in the pile, saying I would be honored to reconcile when she could name a single source she had verified, a single receipt she had read with her own eyes, and a single sentence she regretted saying to her younger daughter the night she turned off the porch light, and I sent it certified, not because I needed proof the letter traveled, but because I wanted her to sign for the truth with the same hand that signed me out of the family. When the wedding invitations went out, I included none of them, not out of malice, but out of arithmetic, because my ceremony could not hold the weight of a repair job nobody had begun. And yet the RSVP that made my stomach drop onto the floor like a paint can came from Lana anyway, handwritten in a loopier script than I remember, claiming self-invitation with a chirpy line about being so excited to see you center stage, finally, which read like a schoolyard taunt dressed in satin, and while Ethan suggested we simply ignore it and instruct the coordinator to redirect her to the parking lot if she tried to waltz down memory lane, I wanted something quieter and sharper, the kind of boundary that hums even when no one is touching it. So I called the venue and requested an update to the seating chart that looked innocuous to everyone except the person who has spent her life arranging appearances, asking that 2 back row chairs be labeled with place cards that matched the formal font of the entire event, one printed with my mother's full name and one with my father's. Not because they were invited, but because if they chose to arrive, they would discover that the only seats reserved for them were at the edge of the room where you can hear the vows but not influence them, and then, because clever does not always need noise, I added a small note to the coordinator's file that any guest arriving without an RSVP should be directed to that row, which is a civilized way to say the era of open seating in my life is over, and as I sealed the email another envelope slid under my apartment door with my maiden name scrawled across it in blue ink, heavy enough to feel like a rock and light enough to be a lie. And when I opened it, I found a plain card that said, "Only we will be there," no signature, no apology, no context, just a promise shaped like a warning, which I set on the counter beside the kettle while my phone began to buzz with a number I recognized from home and chose not to answer because the next call I take from that town will have to begin with something more expensive than a seat in the back row. The morning of my wedding arrived with the kind of stillness that only happens before a storm, a silence so clean it felt borrowed, and as I stood in front of the mirror, surrounded by steam from the curling iron and the scent of lilies crowding every corner, I realized that the years I had spent building this new life had arranged themselves into something steady enough to stand on, yet still fragile enough that one word from home could make it tremble. The makeup artist chatted about weather and vows and color palettes, while my mind hovered somewhere between the past and the aisle waiting outside, rehearsing the motion of walking forward, not toward a man, but toward the final version of myself, the one who survived exile without turning to stone. Ethan's family filled the house with the kind of warmth I used to think existed only in films, people bustling with laughter and gentle chaos, each one genuinely delighted that I existed and that today was mine. They had accepted me not as a project, but as proof that decency can exist without conditions, and as I watched his mother pin a flower to his lapel with tears in her eyes, I felt the strange sensation of being both part of something and slightly outside of it, as if my body had learned to distrust belonging after too many evictions. I didn't cry. I just adjusted my bracelet, the one Ethan gave me when he said, "You don't have to forgive them to free yourself," a line that had sounded philosophical at the time, but now sat in my chest like a warning label. Then my phone buzzed. I didn't check immediately. Old habits die only when you stop feeding them, but something about the vibration had a gravity to it, a pulse that pulled my attention like a thread snagged in fabric. I glanced down, expecting a vendor, maybe a message from a late relative asking for directions. Instead, I saw my father's name. The preview line was short, almost polite. "Please give us a chance to make things right." The words didn't feel handwritten by him, they felt engineered by guilt. Still, my throat tightened, because despite everything, part of me, the girl with the flashlight heart, still wanted to believe that redemption sometimes knocks on the right door. I didn't open the message. I didn't have to. Every version of its possible continuation already lived in my memory, from "we didn't know" to "you should understand" to "family is all that matters." But family, when weaponized, is just captivity dressed in nostalgia. I slipped the phone into my purse with deliberate care, sealing it like a vault, and turned back to the mirror where my reflection looked alarmingly composed, as though grief and rage had agreed to hold hands for the day and behave. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the murmur of guests and the faint echo of music reached me, and I felt the tremor of footsteps behind me, bridesmaids adjusting fabric, photographers whispering instructions, but under it all was a hum, something older and colder. I knew without seeing them that my parents were there. I could feel the heat of unfinished sentences, the phantom weight of their judgment, that peculiar energy people carry when they believe showing up absolves them. My coordinator confirmed it in a whisper. They're in the back row. They didn't RSVP, but they insisted it's family. I nodded as though she had mentioned the weather, because I had been preparing for this weather since the night I left home. The ceremony began. Music swelled with that cinematic precision weddings seem to summon, the kind that fools you into thinking endings can sound like beginnings. I walked through the doors and into the aisle, every step clicking against the wooden floor like punctuation marks in a story I had rewritten myself. Faces blurred into color and light. But near the back, two silhouettes anchored themselves in my peripheral vision, my father's rigid frame and my mother's clasped hands, the choreography of people who mistake endurance for repentance. They didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't even flinch when I looked briefly their way. Maybe they expected tears. They got silence. I thought about how silence had always been our family's favorite instrument, used to punish, to intimidate, to erase, and realized this was the first time I'd ever wielded it back. Every pause in my steps, every breath between vowels, was an act of refusal. When I reached Ethan, I didn't look behind me. The officiant spoke about love as if it were a solvent that could dissolve everything corrosive, and though I wanted to believe him, I knew better. Love cannot rewrite history, it can only refuse to repeat it. I squeezed Ethan's hand hard enough that he understood without words that my calm was not peace, just discipline. After the ceremony, as guests spilled into laughter and clinking glasses, I caught sight of my parents standing uncertainly near the exit. Their expressions the careful blend of pride and regret people use when they realize the script has been rewritten without them. Lana was not there, which made sense. She never liked scenes she didn't direct. My father took a tentative step forward, holding something, maybe a card, maybe his conscience, but I turned to greet a friend before he could speak. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Some words, once spoken, have to live in the silence they created. Later, when the reception lights dimmed and the air filled with music and laughter, I slipped outside for a breath of air that didn't carry perfume or nostalgia. The night smelled like rain about to fall, and the wind carried fragments of conversation, all light and harmless. I opened my purse, looked at my phone, and saw the message still unopened. For a second, my thumb hovered above it. Then I locked the screen and put it away. Some doors, when closed properly, stop rattling forever. I stood under the sky, feeling the weight of my dress and the freedom of not needing witnesses, and realized that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not arrive through a message or a wedding appearance or an apology polished by fear of bad publicity. It would come, if at all, when I no longer needed them to feel smaller for me to feel whole. And that day was not today. So I straightened my veil, took one last look at the horizon that belonged only to me, and walked back inside, leaving the ghosts of that back row behind like discarded programs no one dared to pick up. The night after the wedding stretched long and sleepless, not because of celebration, but because the air felt dense with everything unspoken, the way the sky feels before lightning breaks it open. The guests had gone home, the music had dimmed, and the last of the champagne glasses sat half empty on tables that smelled faintly of roses and wax. Ethan was already asleep, his breathing steady beside me, while I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the rhythm of the rain against the windows matching the slow pulse of my thoughts. All evening, my father's message had sat like a stone in my purse, unacknowledged yet unbearably loud, and the image of them in the back row lingered behind my eyes. Two figures frozen in the act of pretending remorse was enough to resurrect the past they had buried me under. I had thought that walking down the aisle with my head high and my silence deliberate would be enough to feel victorious, but victory, I realized, is rarely clean. It's complicated, layered with exhaustion and a faint ache for what could have been different if people had chosen truth over pride. For years I had imagined this confrontation, the one where they came crawling, where justice arrived wrapped in apology. Yet the reality was quieter, less cinematic, more human in its incompleteness. They hadn't crawled, they had simply appeared, as if proximity could undo exile. And maybe that was their punishment, to stand so close to me and still understand they had no place here. When morning finally bled through the curtains, I slipped out of bed, leaving Ethan's warmth behind, and walked barefoot into the kitchen, where the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. The house smelled of wet earth and distant salt, and I brewed coffee not because I wanted it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I opened my phone, and there it was, the same unopened message, time-stamped from the day before. I thought about deleting it, but deleting would make it vanish too cleanly, and nothing about our story deserved such neat erasure. So instead I opened my laptop, the same one I had used to send the email that began their unmasking years ago, and drafted a single message back, though I knew I would never send it. It began with "You believed lies because they were easier to live within the truth," and ended with "I hope someday you understand that forgiveness is not the same as return." When I finished, I saved it in a folder labeled "Unsent," a graveyard for things I refused to give away. Around noon, the sky cleared, and Ethan suggested a walk by the ocean, so we drove out past the old boardwalk where gulls screamed and salt crusted the air like grief that had learned to sparkle. He didn't ask about the message. He didn't need to. He simply took my hand the way someone does when they know the terrain of your silence. We walked for a long time, until the shoreline blurred into mist, and I told him the part one hadn't told anyone, that I had once loved my sister enough to believe even her cruelties were accidents, that I had once prayed my parents would discover truth on their own without me forcing it into their eyes, and that every piece of revenge I had orchestrated had not come from hatred, but from a desperate hunger to make the world symmetrical again. He listened without interruption, the sea's rhythm filling the spaces between my words, and when I finally stopped, he said only that symmetry is overrated, that life's power lies in its imbalance, and that maybe the point was never to make things even but to make them honest. That night, when we returned home, I found a letter waiting on the porch, the handwriting unfamiliar, but the return address unmistakably from my hometown. Inside was a clipping from the local newspaper, a small note buried on the second page about new findings in the Booster Club investigation, confirming what I already knew: my sister's perfect mask had cracked. She had resigned from her teaching job, citing personal reasons, and moved back in with my parents. At the bottom of the clipping was a handwritten line: "We all pay eventually." No signature. No explanation. Just a sentence that could have come from anyone or everyone. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if it was meant as a threat, a confession, or a strange attempt at truce. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in the same drawer as my wedding photos, not because it belonged there, but because both marked moments when something ended and something else refused to. In the following weeks, I resumed work, attended meetings, and smiled at strangers who had no idea how much history can live inside a single heartbeat. My story had become a quiet legend among those who knew pieces of it, told in fragments like a parable about survival, though no one ever got the ending right because I never gave them one. The truth was that there was no ending, only distance, like a road stretching into fog. I did not block my father's number, but I never answered it either. I did not unfriend my mother, but I never scrolled through her posts. And I did not hate Lana anymore. Hatred requires energy, and she no longer had access to mine. One evening, months later, I returned to the beach where Ethan had proposed, and I brought with me the phone that had once carried every message I thought could destroy or save me. The screen was cracked now, the battery weak, but it still held that unopened text. I watched the tide come in, patient and relentless, and thought about how the ocean never asks permission to erase its own footprints. I powered on the phone, opened the message, and read it at last. It said, "Only we love you. Please come home." I smiled, not cruelly, but with the calm of someone who has finally understood that home is not where forgiveness lives, it's where truth is allowed to breathe. Then I dropped the phone into the water, watched the waves claim it without ceremony, and stood there until it vanished beneath the surface, leaving no bubbles, no sound, no proof except the quiet conviction that I had finally, irrevocably, walked out of the storm.